The document should not have existed. It was a single sheet of yellowing paper buried inside a misfiled folder at the bottom of a locked cabinet in a defense subcontractor's archive. No classification stamp, no routing number, just one handwritten phrase across the top margin. MK Ultra Subproject 107, Behavioral Field Test. When I first saw it, I assumed it was a fake, a misplaced prop, or maybe someone's idea of a dark joke. But the deeper I looked, the more disturbing the implications became, because Subproject 107 referenced something impossible, a failed U.S. weapons test in 1978, an event that was officially blamed on system malfunction, not human behavior. Yet the language inside the file suggested the opposite. The failure was deliberate, and potentially the result of a covert psychological conditioning program conducted on unwitting military personnel. Before we go further, let's define the official story. In August 1978, at a remote proving ground in Nevada, the U.S. military tested a prototype guidance system intended for next-generation weapons. Midway through the test, the system malfunctioned. The weapon veered off course, struck an empty stretch of desert, and the program was quietly shelved. The incident never appeared in public reports. It was barely a footnote even inside Defense Department records. But rumors spread among personnel who were there that day. Whispers about a technician who suddenly froze, ignored emergency procedures, and stared blankly at the console while alarms screamed. According to those who spoke off-record, the technician claimed he had heard a voice, and before anyone could react, the weapon catastrophically misfired. The Pentagon dismissed the testimony as stress-induced hallucination. Decades passed, the story faded, and then came the file. I received it from a retired engineer, someone who had worked on classified weapons systems during the 70s. He told me he had kept the file because it felt wrong to destroy it. When I asked where it came from, he just shook his head. It wasn't supposed to exist, he said. But if it's real, you need to understand what they were trying to do. That's when I began tracing the term written at the top, Subproject 107. Most MK Ultra subprojects are known, at least by name. 107 wasn't one of them. And when I tried to request related documents from the National Archives, I was told something unsettling. No records responsive to that designation exist. Not classified, not withheld, they simply don't exist. I spoke with a former intelligence historian who told me that this phrasing is often a red flag, a sign that a project was outsourced, compartmentalized, or deliberately mislabeled to avoid congressional oversight. And then he said something that stopped me cold. Some MK Ultra subprojects weren't about interrogation. They were about command, influence, conditioning, not breaking minds, but building new pathways into them. The implication was clear. If Subproject 107 was real, and if the technician in 1978 really behaved as witnesses claimed, then we may be looking at something far more dangerous than a rogue experiment, a case where mind conditioning research intersected with U.S. weapons systems. At that point, I needed answers. So I did what any investigative reporter does. I started following the paper trail. I searched declassified records, intelligence budgets, obscure contractor logs, and congressional inquiries. Most paths led nowhere. But then, buried inside a 1983 budget justification report, I found a strange line item under a research contractor connected to the Air Force. Behavioral Stress Interface Studies, 1977 to 1979. The description was intentionally vague, but one phrase stood out: Applied Studies in Cognitive Override During Operational Tasks. Cognitive override, a term I had never seen in any military psychology literature. I spoke to a former defense psychologist who told me the term was used informally by intelligence-linked researchers studying whether human decision-making in high-stress environments could be interrupted or redirected through external triggers. Most of the ideas were theoretical, he said, except for one proposal, and I really hope you didn't find it. I asked him what he meant. He exhaled, then said, "There was a belief, unproven, but seriously explored, that if you exposed a person to specific patterns during training, you could later trigger a behavioral lock under stress, a kind of induced paralysis or redirection, but it was considered too dangerous, too unpredictable." I showed him the lost MK Ultra file. His face drained of color. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. I told him. He pushed the document away. "If this is what I think it is, then the 1978 failure wasn't a malfunction. It was a field test." At that moment, I realized I needed to understand who the technician was and why a weapons failure would be connected to a project designed to manipulate cognition. The answers, as you'll see, lead somewhere far darker. For weeks, I searched for the technician's real identity. The Air Force records from 1978 listed only initials. RM, age 26, civilian contractor, no disciplinary issues, no psychological history. But when I cross-referenced the initials with personnel rosters from that era, something strange happened. RM didn't appear anywhere. Not in payroll lists, not in medical logs, not in security clearance registries. It was like he had been deliberately erased. The only reason we know he existed at all is because 3 people who were present that day, a weapons engineer, a test conductor, and an Air Force medic, gave statements shortly after the incident. Their testimonies were identical in one unsettling detail. RM stood motionless, eyes unfocused, unresponsive to shouts and alarms, murmuring something under his breath, right before the guidance system failed. The official transcripts only record one phrase clearly: "It's starting now." When I spoke to the retired medic who treated him afterward, he said RM's pulse was normal, body temperature normal, no signs of panic or physical collapse, but his pupils were dilated, as if he'd taken a powerful hallucinogen. The medic said he reported this immediately, but within hours he was instructed to modify his statement. "They told me stress does weird things," he said, "but that wasn't stress. Stress makes you frantic." He looked programmed. That word echoed in my mind as I continued digging. I eventually tracked down the weapons engineer, a man in his 70s now, living quietly in Arizona. He refused to talk at first, but after several attempts he finally agreed to meet me in a small diner off a deserted highway. When I asked him what he remembered about the test, he didn't hesitate. "We were told it was mechanical failure," he said, "but every one of us knew it wasn't. Something made that kid freeze. I've seen people panic. That wasn't panic." I showed him the MK Ultra sheet with Subproject 107 written across the top. He didn't even touch it. He just stared at it like it was radioactive. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. I explained. He shook his head. "Listen, people think MK Ultra ended in the 60s. It didn't. They just changed the names, moved the funding, outsourced the work. The military wanted soldiers who couldn't be interrogated, who couldn't break under stress, who could operate in total sensory chaos. But to build that, you have to understand how to interrupt the human mind." "Interrupt it how?" I asked. He leaned forward. "By overriding instinct, by inserting something else." I pressed him further, but he wouldn't say another word. Instead, he told me something that reframed the entire investigation. After the failure, we were instructed never to speak to RM again, and 2 days later, he was gone, packed up, Transferred, they said, but nobody knew to where. A transfer with no receiving base, no paperwork, no record. Disappeared. After that meeting, the direction of my investigation shifted. If RM had disappeared, someone had to have removed him from the system, and that meant looking into the contractors responsible for psychological screening and training. That led me to an organization I had never heard of, the Human Performance Research Wing, a division of a defense contractor that dissolved in the early 80s. Most of its projects remain classified, but among its surviving documents, I found one chilling phrase repeated over and over: behavioral trigger conditioning. At first, it sounded like generic training language, until I found an archived grant proposal describing the goal: to explore stimulus-induced modulation of prefrontal decision pathways for rapid compliance or interruption during operational scenarios. Rapid compliance, interruption during operational tasks. It was the same concept as cognitive override. I contacted a neuroscientist who had worked with military research programs. I read the description to her. She paused for a long time before saying, "That's not training. That's conditioning." "How?" I asked. "By repeatedly pairing stress signals with a specific external cue. Over time, you can create a neurological shortcut, a bypass. Depending on the cue, it can freeze a person or force them into a compliance reflex." "And what kind of cue are we talking about?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she said, "Usually a sound, a phrase, a tone pattern, a phrase." I couldn't stop thinking about the words RM supposedly muttered moments before the malfunction. It's starting now. Was he repeating the cue? Responding to it? Triggered by it? Or was he announcing something he had been conditioned to do? The neuroscientist told me something else, something I haven't been able to forget. If someone participated in that kind of conditioning without their consent, the trigger can be activated years later, even accidentally. And once it happens, you can't predict the outcome. Freeze, panic, blind action, total shutdown, anything. Which raised the most terrifying question of all. What if the weapons test failure in 1978 wasn't the only time the trigger activated? Because as I dug deeper, I found a second incident and a second missing technician. But that's a story for the next chapter. I found the second incident completely by accident, buried in an Air Force investigative digest from 1981, a report so obscure it had never been digitized. There was a brief, almost dismissive reference to a procedural disruption at a munitions calibration lab in Colorado. No names, no details, but one sentence caught my eye. Subject became unresponsive following exposure to patterned auditory instruction. Auditory instruction, the same category of cue the neuroscientist had warned me about. I spent 3 weeks trying to determine who the subject was. Finally, through a retired administrator willing to search through old microfilm, I found a name: E.S., age 29, electronics specialist. And just like RM, there were no subsequent records of him anywhere. No transfers, no medical discharge, no retirement status, no death certificate. 2 technicians in 2 separate facilities, 3 years apart, both disappearing after incidents involving sudden cognitive shutdown. At this point, I needed to know whether these 2 men were connected. I contacted a former Air Force intelligence officer who had worked inside weapons development programs during the Cold War. He listened patiently as I described both cases. When I finished, he didn't ask for the documents. He didn't ask how I found the names. He just said, "You found the shadow program." I asked him what he meant. He explained that during the late 70s, the Air Force, CIA, and several contractors collaborated on what he called behavioral interoperability research, an attempt to test whether human operators could be made more predictable under extreme stress by introducing subconscious behavioral pathways during training. He emphasized that the project was not officially listed as MKUltra. It wasn't MKUltra, he said, but it was MKUltra's ghost. The same people, the same contractors, the same ambitions, only the label changed. Then he asked if the technicians had shown signs of preloaded pattern exposure. I told him about the queues, the shutdowns, the missing files, the vanishing men. His face tightened. They never should have done field tests, he said. It was meant to stay theoretical. Once you run it on actual operators, you can't predict what will happen. You can't contain it. I asked him directly, why did both men disappear? He exhaled slowly. Because they weren't supposed to break, and when they did, it proved the entire architecture was unstable. The safest option was to isolate the subjects permanently and bury the documentation. He told me something else, something I wasn't prepared to hear. According to him, Subproject 107 wasn't designed to create paralysis. That was a side effect of early prototypes. The real objective was far more ambitious: to build operators who could take instant action in life-or-death scenarios based on preconditioned triggers, without hesitation, without fear, without conscious processing. A human guidance system. But the human mind was too unpredictable, and when the triggers misfired, the results were catastrophic. The officer looked down at his coffee cup and said quietly, "If those two incidents are connected, it means the program didn't fail because it didn't work. It failed because it did." I pressed him for more. He refused. But before leaving, he gave me a name. Someone he claimed had overseen the behavioral research transition after MKUltra was supposedly dismantled. Dr. Anthony Keller, a cognitive engineer who worked under classified contracts from 1972 to 1985. It took 4 months to locate him. When I finally knocked on the door of his small house outside Seattle, a woman answered, his daughter. She told me Dr. Keller had died in 2019. But when I explained why I had come, her expression changed. She said her father had left behind boxes of research materials. Most were technical, but one folder had disturbed her for years. She brought it out. Inside were handwritten notes, sketches of neural pathways, and a single typed memo, unsigned, undated, referencing a behavioral latency cascade observed in subject RM during a field-embedded trigger evaluation. There was also a line written in pencil above the text. Response latency exceeds tolerance thresholds. Cease testing immediately. But the most chilling page was the last one, a brief reflection Keller had written to himself. The conditioning frameworks are too unstable. The subjects are not tools. Their minds are not empty spaces. The system pushes back. The system breaks. And when the system breaks, it breaks the person with it. I asked Keller's daughter what she thought it meant. She hesitated, then said, "My father believed the program crossed the line, not just ethically, but technically. He said the human mind isn't a machine you can overwrite. He said the people who kept pushing the research didn't understand that. And who kept pushing it? I asked. She closed the folder. He never said, only that they were above him. When I left her house, I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, above him. How high does that go? How many programs shifted names but never really ended? How many people like RM and ES were pulled into experiments they didn't consent to? And how many failures were quietly rewritten as mechanical errors or procedural anomalies? One final detail haunts me. In the memo about the 1978 weapons failure, there is a line that almost no one would notice on the first read. A coded designation referencing Phase 2 readiness. Phase 2, meaning whatever happened in 1978 was Phase 1, a test, a beginning. And according to Keller's notes, Phase 2 was scheduled for early 1980. But I haven't been able to find a single document indicating whether Phase 2 went forward or where. And if it did, there may be more missing technicians, more erased files, more unexplained failures rewritten as harmless accidents. The lost MK Ultra file that started this investigation doesn't give answers. It gives something far more dangerous, a map of the questions no one was ever supposed to ask. And now that map is in the open.